Inside Hitler's bunker. The last 48 hours. April 28, 1945. 3:47 in the afternoon. Beneath the shattered streets of Berlin, in a concrete tomb 30 feet below the Reich Chancellery garden, the air tastes of mildew and diesel fumes. The walls sweat condensation. A single electric bulb flickers in the narrow corridor, casting shadows that dance like ghosts across peeling paint and water-stained concrete. The ventilation system hums, a mechanical wheeze struggling against the weight of rubble above. Outside, the thunder of Soviet artillery rolls across the city in unending waves, each detonation sending fine dust cascading from the ceiling like poisoned snow. Down here, in the Führerbunker, time has become elastic, meaningless. Day and night exist only as concepts. The Third Reich, which Adolf Hitler once proclaimed would last 1,000 years, has been reduced to these 18 cramped rooms, a labyrinth of defeated dreams smelling of unwashed bodies, burnt coffee, and the acrid tang of cyanide glass crushing underfoot. The bunker had been completed in 1944, an architectural afterthought to an earlier shelter system, reinforced with 16-foot-thick concrete walls and a ceiling designed to withstand 500-pound bombs. It was never meant to be a headquarters. It was meant to be a refuge, temporary and functional. But as the Reich crumbled, as the Soviets surged westward and the Americans and British pressed from the opposite direction, this concrete sarcophagus became the last seat of Nazi power. Here, the man who had commanded armies across Europe, who had sent millions to their deaths in pursuit of a twisted vision of racial supremacy, now shuffled through dim corridors in a stained uniform, his left hand trembling uncontrollably, his eyes vacant and yellowed. The transformation was almost incomprehensible. 6 years earlier, Hitler had stood before roaring crowds in Nuremberg, his voice electrifying hundreds of thousands, his arm thrust forward in salute as an entire nation seemed to bend to his will. Now, he was a phantom, a broken shell whose orders were ignored, whose rage echoed impotently against concrete walls. The final 48 hours of Hitler's life unfolded in this subterranean tomb like a grotesque opera, part tragedy, part farce, wholly suffused with delusion and decay. To understand those hours is to witness the final collapse not just of a man, but of an ideology that had consumed a continent in flame. By late April 1945, Berlin was a dying city. The Red Army had encircled it completely, their artillery positioned so close that Soviet gunners could adjust their aim by watching where shells landed in the smoke-choked streets. Over 2.5 million Soviet troops, supported by more than 6,000 tanks and 40,000 artillery pieces, were grinding through the city block by block, building by building. The German defenders, a ragtag collection of Wehrmacht remnants, SS fanatics, Hitler Youth barely old enough to shave, and elderly Volkssturm conscripts armed with antiquated rifles and single-shot Panzerfaust rockets, fought with the desperation of men who knew what awaited them. The Soviets had not forgotten Stalingrad, or Leningrad, or the countless atrocities committed on Russian soil. This was not just military conquest. This was retribution. Inside the bunker, reality had become negotiable. Hitler's daily military conferences continued, but they had devolved into theatrical absurdities. Generals reported on the movements of divisions that no longer existed. Phantom reinforcements were discussed with earnest detail. Hitler traced movements on maps with trembling fingers, issuing orders for counterattacks that would never materialize, demanding that units fight to the last man in positions already overrun days before. His staff nodded, took notes, and quietly ignored him. The disconnect between the bunker's fantasy and the inferno above was total. Officers who ventured up the concrete stairs to the surface returned ashen-faced, their uniforms scorched, their reports deliberately vague to spare Hitler the full horror of Berlin's annihilation. The bunker population had swelled to nearly 500 people by late April. Officers, secretaries, guards, communications personnel, servants, Hitler's personal physician Dr. Ludwig Stumpfegger, and his longtime companion Eva Braun, who had arrived in mid-April against Hitler's wishes, determined to die at his side. They moved through the crowded corridors like passengers on a sinking ship, some maintaining rigid military discipline, others surrendering to alcohol and hysteria. The smell was overwhelming: sweat, urine, the sweet rot of infection from wounded soldiers brought down for medical attention, the chemical reek of cyanide ampoules that many carried in their pockets like talismans. Sleep was impossible except in brief, nightmare-riddled intervals. The Soviet bombardment never ceased. The walls shook. The lights died and returned and died again. On April 28th, two pieces of information reached Hitler that would set in motion the final act. The first came via radio intercept. Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsführer SS, Hitler's most loyal servant, the architect of the Holocaust, had been secretly negotiating surrender terms with the Western Allies through Count Folke Bernadotte of Sweden. For Hitler, this was the ultimate betrayal. Himmler, der true Heinrich, faithful Heinrich, had been the embodiment of SS fanaticism, the guardian of racial purity, the executioner of Hitler's most monstrous commands. That he would seek accommodation, that he would abandon the principle of total victory or total destruction, shattered whatever remained of Hitler's psychological coherence. He raged through the bunker, spittle flying from his lips, his face mottled purple, shrieking denunciations of traitors and cowards. He ordered Himmler arrested and executed, an order that would never be carried out but which consumed him with vindictive fury. The second piece of information concerned Benito Mussolini. Reports arrived that the Italian dictator, Hitler's Axis partner and ideological ally, had been captured by Italian partisans while attempting to flee to Switzerland. He and his mistress Clara Petacci had been executed on April 28, shot, and then hung by their heels from a metal girder at a Milan gas station, their bodies mutilated by crowds who spat and hurled stones. Photographs would soon circulate, grainy images of Mussolini's corpse suspended upside down, his mistress beside him, both displayed like slaughtered animals for a jeering mob. When Hitler saw these reports, something inside him calcified into final resolution. He would not be captured. He would not be paraded before tribunals or cameras. He would not hang from a rope or face a firing squad. He would control his own end. The bunker had become a theater of madness. In one room, Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels sat with his wife Magda, discussing the fate of their 6 children, blonde, blue-eyed exemplars of Aryan perfection, aged 4 to 12, who played in the upper bunker, unaware that their parents had decided they would not survive the Reich's collapse. In another room, wounded soldiers lay on makeshift cots, their groans a constant background accompaniment. Hitler's physician dispensed morphine with abandon. Some officers drank themselves into stupors. Others sat rigid at desks, mechanically shuffling papers as if routine could hold back oblivion. Eva Braun, 33 years old, moved through the chaos with an eerie calm, smoking cigarettes, comforting secretaries, behaving as if she were hostessing a cocktail party rather than awaiting death in a bunker. She had been Hitler's mistress for more than 12 years, kept carefully hidden from public view, a secret companion in mountain retreats and Berlin apartments. Now, in these final hours, she would receive the recognition she had long craved. Shortly after midnight on April 29th, now less than 48 hours before the end, Hitler summoned a municipal councillor named Walter Wagner to perform a civil marriage ceremony. Wagner, a minor Nazi Party functionary dressed in a Volkssturm uniform, had been plucked from a combat unit and brought to the bunker for this surreal purpose. In a small conference room, with Joseph Goebbels and Martin Bormann serving as witnesses, Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun were married. The ceremony was brief, almost businesslike. Both bride and groom had to affirm their Aryan ancestry. Eva began to sign her name, Eva B., and then crossed it out, writing instead, Eva Hitler, née Braun. It was said to be the happiest moment of her life. After the ceremony, there was a modest wedding breakfast, champagne and sandwiches, during which Hitler rambled to his secretaries about his decision, about his regrets, about his belief that history would vindicate him. Outside, Berlin burned. Hitler spent much of April 29th dictating his last will and political testament to his secretary Traudl Junge, a young woman who had joined his staff in 1942. The documents are remarkable for their complete absence of introspection or remorse. In his political testament, Hitler expelled Himmler and Hermann Göring from the party, denouncing them as traitors. He appointed Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor as Reich President and Goebbels as Reich Chancellor. He justified every action of his regime, blamed the war entirely on international Jewry, and insisted that he had always sought peace, but had been forced into conflict by enemies who envied Germany's resurgence. There was no acknowledgement of the Holocaust, no recognition of the tens of millions dead, no hint that his ideology might have been flawed. Instead, there was only the narcissistic grievance of a man who believed himself persecuted by fate and betrayed by subordinates unworthy of his vision. His personal will was equally revealing. He left his possessions to the party, or if it no longer existed, to the German state, or if that too had ceased, to his surviving relatives. He specified that his art collection should go to a gallery in Linz, the Austrian city of his youth, a museum for a Reich that would never exist. The physical act of survival in the bunker during these hours was a constant struggle. The water supply had become contaminated. Food stocks dwindled to canned vegetables and military rations. The toilets frequently backed up. The smell of excrement mixed with the smell of fear. Soviet shells landed with increasing proximity, some so close that the concussions extinguished candles and knocked items from shelves. Reports filtered down of Soviet infantry only blocks away, sometimes only hundreds of meters distant. Tank engines could be heard, a deep mechanical growl that penetrated even the thick concrete. Radio communications with the outside world grew sporadic. Messengers who left the bunker often never returned, killed by shellfire or snipers or simply choosing escape over suicide. Hitler's daily routine had become a parody of his former discipline. He rose late, shuffled through conferences where he still discussed grand strategy, picked at meals he barely touched, and fed his German shepherd, Blondi, the one creature in the bunker toward whom he showed consistent affection. On April 29th, in a grotesque test of the cyanide capsules supplied by the SS, Hitler had Blondi poisoned. The dog convulsed and died within seconds. Hitler watched, perhaps to verify the capsule's effectiveness, perhaps to spare the animal whatever fate awaited once Soviet soldiers poured into the bunker. After Blondi's death, Hitler seemed to retreat even further into himself, speaking less, staring at walls, his tremor worsening. The symbolism was almost too obvious. The dog, loyal unto death, destroyed by its master's hand. Throughout the Third Reich, loyalty had been the supreme virtue demanded by Hitler and his regime. Loyalty to the Führer, to the Volk, to the race. Loyalty enforced by oaths, by propaganda, by terror. And now, in the bunker's final hours, that loyalty had curdled into something monstrous. Officers remained not out of conviction but inertia or fear. The Goebbels children would be murdered by their parents in the name of loyalty to an ideology that had already murdered millions. Blondi died because her master chose extinction over surrender. The bunker had become a shrine to loyalty perverted into mass death cult. The Americans and British, by contrast, represented something Hitler had never understood and always despised, a form of democratic abundance that made loyalty voluntary rather than compelled. When German POWs had been captured by Western Allied forces, they encountered something bewildering: treatment according to Geneva Conventions, food in quantities they hadn't seen in years, medical care, even the possibility of correspondence with families. German soldiers who had expected brutal retaliation for their own army's crimes instead found themselves in camps where survival was not merely possible but expected. This wasn't weakness, as Nazi propaganda claimed. It was the expression of societies wealthy enough and confident enough to afford mercy. The American industrial machine had buried the Wehrmacht under an avalanche of tanks, planes, trucks, and supplies that German industry, stripped of resources and battered by strategic bombing, could never match. By 1945, an American infantry division had mobility and firepower that dwarfed its German equivalent. American soldiers ate hot meals trucked to the front. They wore winter coats that actually protected against cold. They had access to medical care that saved lives German soldiers would have considered beyond hope. This abundance was ideological as much as material. Democratic societies, for all their flaws, did not demand that citizens immolate themselves for abstract concepts of racial destiny. They did not require loyalty unto death. They operated on a principle Hitler found contemptible, the notion that individual lives had inherent value, that surrender was preferable to annihilation, that compromise was not weakness, but wisdom. In his bunker, surrounded by the wreckage of his thousand-year Reich, Hitler remained incapable of grasping this. His ideology allowed only total victory or total destruction. There was no middle ground, no possibility of negotiated peace, no recognition that the German people might deserve survival even if the Nazi state did not. April 30th, 1945. The final day. Soviet forces had reached the Reichstag, barely a quarter-mile from the bunker. Red Army soldiers were raising flags over captured buildings, fighting room to room through rubble and ruins. Artillery fire was so close that the bunker's telephone switchboard operators could hear shell impacts even through concrete. Hitler rose late in the afternoon, around 2 p.m. He said farewell to the bunker staff, secretaries, guards, adjutants, in a formal procession. He shook hands mechanically, his palm cold and damp, his eyes unfocused. Many were weeping. He offered no apologies, no last words of wisdom, just a limp handshake and a mumbled, Auf Wiedersehen. He retreated to his personal suite with Eva Hitler at his side. What happened next was reconstructed from accounts of those who remained in the bunker and from forensic evidence. Shortly before 3:30 p.m., Hitler and Eva retired to a sitting room. Eva took cyanide. The poison acted almost instantly, causing her to collapse onto the couch. Hitler, it appears, both bit into a cyanide capsule and simultaneously shot himself in the right temple with his Walther PPK pistol, a 7.65 mm weapon he had carried for years. The gunshot was heard by those waiting outside, a single, muffled crack that nevertheless seemed to reverberate through the confined space. Valet Heinz Ling and others waited several minutes before entering. When they opened the door, they found Hitler slumped on the couch, blood running from his temple, pooling on the armrest, dripping onto the carpet. Eva lay beside him, unmarked, her lips slightly parted, smelling faintly of bitter almonds. The room smelled of cordite and cyanide and the peculiar copper scent of fresh blood. The bodies were carried up the concrete stairs to the Chancellery garden. This required multiple trips and considerable effort. The bunker exit was narrow, the stairs steep. Soviet shells continued to fall. The small garden, once carefully landscaped, was a cratered moonscape. Hitler and Eva were placed in a shallow shell crater. Gasoline was poured over them, approximately 40 gallons, brought in jerry cans from the bunker's emergency supplies. Matches were struck, and the bodies ignited. The cremation was incomplete. Gasoline fires burn hot, but not hot enough to fully consume human remains. The bodies charred and partially burned while bunker staff watched from the emergency exit, occasionally raising their arms in final Nazi salutes as shells burst nearby. It was a shabby, desperate end, a Viking funeral conducted in a bombed-out garden with Soviet tanks approaching from all directions. Joseph Goebbels, now technically Reich Chancellor for barely a day, understood that Hitler's death changed nothing. The military situation was hopeless. That evening, Goebbels made one final attempt to negotiate with the Soviets, not surrender, but some kind of armistice. General Hans Krebs, who spoke Russian, was sent under a white flag to meet with Soviet commanders. He informed them of Hitler's death and Donet's succession, but offered no unconditional surrender. The Soviet response was unequivocal: total capitulation or total destruction. Krebs returned to the bunker with this answer. Goebbels, who had orchestrated Nazi propaganda for 12 years, who had sent Germans to die with speeches about duty and sacrifice, now prepared to enact his final propaganda gesture. On May 1st, Magda Goebbels murdered her 6 children. She had them dressed in nightgowns and sedated, likely with morphine. Then, probably with the assistance of an SS doctor, she placed cyanide capsules in their mouths and crushed them. The children, Helga, Hilda, Helmut, Hold, Hedda, and Heidi, died in their bunker beds, victims of their parents' fanaticism. Shortly afterward, Joseph and Magda Goebbels climbed to the garden. Accounts vary, but the most credible suggests that an SS orderly shot them both at their request, then attempted to burn the bodies. When Soviet troops overran the Chancellery complex hours later, they found the charred corpses of the Goebbels family amid rubble and spent shell casings. Soviet forces discovered Hitler's remains on May 4th. The bodies of Hitler and Eva had been hastily buried in a shell crater, covered with dirt and debris. Soviet intelligence officers, working from descriptions provided by captured bunker personnel, located the remains, exhumed them, and conducted forensic examinations. Hitler's body was badly burned but identifiable through dental records. His unique dental work, including bridges and crowns, matched precisely with records maintained by his dentist. The Soviets initially kept the discovery secret, Stalin himself preferring to maintain ambiguity about Hitler's fate for strategic purposes. Rumors persisted for years that Hitler had escaped to Argentina, to Antarctica, to some hidden refuge. But the dental evidence was conclusive. The man who had plunged Europe into the most destructive war in human history had died by his own hand in a concrete hole, his body burned and buried like refuse. The bunker's remaining occupants attempted breakouts on the night of May 1st and into May 2nd. Most were killed or captured within hours. Some successfully escaped through subway tunnels and sewers, slipping through Soviet lines in the chaos. A few managed to evade capture for weeks or months. Many chose suicide rather than face Soviet captivity. Officers shot themselves, bit cyanide capsules, or were shot by comrades at their own request. The bunker, when finally secured by Soviet troops, was a charnel house, bodies in corridors, bloodstains on walls, the stench of death so thick that soldiers had to retreat gasping for air. The final 48 hours of Hitler's life revealed the ultimate bankruptcy of fascist ideology. National Socialism had promised national rebirth, racial purity, territorial expansion, and a new order that would sweep away the decadence of liberal democracy. It delivered genocide, total war, and civilizational collapse. The Reich that was to last a millennium lasted 12 years. The master race proved as mortal and fallible as any other. The Superman ideology that elevated will over reason, myth over truth, and blood over humanity ended in a bunker stinking of urine and betrayal. German soldiers who had believed in Hitler's vision, who had marched into Poland and France and Russia convinced of their historical mission, discovered too late that they had served a monster. The fortunate ones were captured by American or British forces and lived to return home. The unfortunate fell into Soviet hands and faced years in Siberian camps, punishment for crimes they may or may not have personally committed, but which had been done in their nation's name. And always there was the question, what had they expected? They had expected victory, certainly. They had expected glory and vindication. They had been told they were a superior people reclaiming their rightful place. Instead, they received ruin and shame, their cities reduced to rubble, their nation divided, their ideology revealed as a death cult that consumed its own children. The bunker itself stands as monument to this delusion. In the decades after the war, it was systematically destroyed by the Soviets and later by unified German authorities, filled with rubble and sealed, the land above it converted to parking lots and apartment buildings. There is no plaque, no memorial, nothing to mark the spot where Hitler died. This erasure is intentional, a refusal to allow the site to become a pilgrimage point for neo-Nazi devotees, a determination that some places should be consigned to unmarked oblivion. Yet the historical record remains, preserved in testimony and documentation and forensic evidence. The bunker's final hours demonstrate with awful clarity the trajectory of totalitarianism, from triumphant rallies to concrete tombs, from dreams of empire to the reality of ashes, from promises of eternal glory to the mundane grotesquerie of botched cremations in shell-cratered gardens. Hitler had imagined himself a world historical figure, a Caesar or Napoleon who would reshape civilization. He was, instead, the architect of his own nation's destruction, a man who sacrificed millions to a vision that was rotten at its core, who inspired loyalty unto death and repaid it with annihilation. The contrast with democratic societies could not be starker. While Hitler's followers died in bunkers or were murdered by their parents or chose cyanide over captivity, American and British soldiers were returning home to nations that celebrated their service, but did not demand their worship. The Marshall Plan would soon rebuild Western Europe, including Germany itself, not out of weakness, but out of recognition that prosperity and democracy were antidotes to extremism. The abundance of democratic capitalism, the material wealth, the technological innovation, the freedom to dissent and debate and change governments through ballots rather than bullets had proved more powerful than fascist ideology's promises of glory and racial destiny. In the end, the bunker symbolism is complete. It was a concrete womb that became a tomb, a refuge that became a prison, a headquarters that became a mausoleum. Hitler entered it as dictator of Germany and exited it as a charred corpse. The ideology he championed died with him in that garden, its promises exposed as lies, its monuments reduced to ruins, its leaders dead by suicide or execution or imprisonment. What remained was the memory of atrocity and the determination, imperfect, often failing, but genuine, that such madness should never again consume the world. The last 48 hours of Hitler's life were not dramatic in the cinematic sense. There were no grand speeches, no final confrontations, no moments of redemption or revelation. There was only squalor and delusion, petty betrayals and desperate suicides, the banal evil of administrators following orders even as their world collapsed. It was an ending both fitting and pathetic, a man who had styled himself a Superman dying like a cornered rat, his Reich surviving him by barely a week, his vision of 1,000 years extinguished in fire and blood. And so the bunker fell silent. The artillery stopped. Soviet soldiers raised their flag over the Reichstag's ruined dome. In cellars throughout Berlin, survivors emerged, blinking, into daylight, stepping over corpses and rubble to face an uncertain future. The war in Europe was over. The reckoning was beginning. And beneath a parking lot in the heart of Berlin, sealed under tons of concrete and earth, the bunker remains, not a monument, but a grave, a place where an ideology died and deserved to die, where the promise of 1,000-year Reich met the reality of 48 final hours in darkness and despair.